Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
So right now, somewhere in Ukraine, an offensive cruise missile manufacturer is frantically trying to figure out how to build a defensive ballistic shield.
Right.
And they've been given exactly 1 year to pull off what usually takes massive global defense conglomerates, like a decade to engineer.
Yeah, it's wild.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are really glad you're joining us. Today we're looking at a nation attempting to force an industrial revolution while they're literally under constant fire.
Which is a frankly staggering situation to look at.
It really is. We're unpacking a stack of fresh, intersecting dispatches today. We've got reporting from Reuters, The Independent, and Anadolu Agency. And our main mission here is to dissect this highly ambitious, honestly, almost unimaginable pitch from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Right, the push for a brand new independent European ballistic missile shield.
Exactly. And building a continental missile shield sounds like a multi-decade project, but Ukraine wants it in 1 year. So we're asking, are we looking at a pipe dream here, or is this a necessity born out of absolute desperation?
Well, to really understand that 1 year deadline, we have to recognize that in a war of attrition, time is a luxury neither side has.
Yeah.
To get why this is being pushed so aggressively, you have to look at the immediate existential threats that are just raining down and dismantling Ukraine's energy grid right now.
So we're going to look at 3 distinct layers of their security reality today. Grand international defense strategy, then cross-border offensive strikes, and finally, a really shocking breakdown in domestic street-level security.
Let's start with that core focus, the European missile shield concept. Because according to Reuters, Zelensky recently went on the National Marathon TV channel and announced this plan.
Right.
He said Ukraine is in active negotiations with several unnamed European countries to build this system, unequivocally stating they need their own anti-ballistic missile defense system within a year.
And the specific emphasis on ballistic missiles is, that's key to understanding the physics of this.
Yeah.
Right? Because we hear the word missile, and we just tend to group them all together. But Russia is using ballistic missiles for a very specific strategic purpose.
Right, to decimate Ukraine's thermal power generation and electricity transmission.
Yeah, and ballistic missiles are fundamentally different from drones or, say, the slower cruise missiles. They get launched high into the atmosphere, sometimes into suborbit.
Exactly.
And then they come screaming down on their targets at hypersonic speeds.
And because of that sheer velocity and the really steep trajectory of their descent, intercepting a ballistic missile is an incredibly complex engineering problem.
Right, you can't just put up a net.
No, exactly. You aren't just shooting an explosive into the sky and hoping the shrapnel hits the target. You are relying on what's called kinetic kill vehicle technology.
Which sounds like something out of science fiction.
It kind of is. Instead of using explosives to blow up the incoming weapon, a kinetic kill vehicle literally slams into it at Mach 5 or higher. It's the equivalent of trying to shoot a bullet out of the sky with another bullet. The math and the radar tracking have to be absolutely perfect.
And currently, Ukraine relies almost entirely on the American-made Patriot missile system to perform that math. It's one of the few systems on Earth capable of this specific kind of interception.
Yes. But the Reuters dispatches highlight a severe global supply chain crisis emerging around the Patriot.
Right, because Ukraine is finding them desperately hard to acquire right now. And that's largely because they're being heavily deployed by the U.S. and its allies in the Gulf region.
Yeah, to counter Iranian missile threats. So the geopolitics of air defense are just shifting dramatically.
Which leaves a huge gap.
It does. The United States simply cannot manufacture and deploy enough Patriot batteries to simultaneously cover the Middle East and fully shield Eastern Europe,
leaving this massive vulnerability for Ukraine. And when we look at Europe, the native defense industry, it becomes really clear that their supply chains were just never built for a grinding, high-intensity land war of this scale.
No, not at all. The sources mention the Italo-French ASMPT system, which is essentially Europe's only equivalent to the Patriot.
But the production numbers are incredibly low, right?
Exactly. Europe's peacetime industrial base cannot physically scale up production fast enough to cover the gaps in Ukraine's air defense network.
Which brings us to a super fascinating detail in the reporting. Because the established defense giants are struggling with capacity, a Ukrainian company called Firepoint is stepping in.
And this is where the story takes a really remarkable turn. Because Firepoint is known primarily as the manufacturer of Ukraine's Flamingo cruise missile.
Right, which is an offensive weapon.
Yes, but they told Reuters they are in talks with European companies to launch a low-cost alternative to the Patriot system by next year.
Okay, I have to push back on the feasibility of this because it sounds like a monumental leap. I mean, it's like trying to build a new heavy-duty roof for your house while it's currently pouring rain just because your neighbor took back their umbrella.
That's a very apt analogy.
Right. Because from an engineering standpoint, you can't just take the engine out of a cruise missile, point it straight up, and call it an air defense system.
Definitely not.
A cruise missile is designed to fly low, relatively slow, follow a topographical map. But an anti-ballistic interceptor requires hyper-advanced phased array radar, split-second computing, and physical thrusters to maneuver at hypersonic speeds in the upper atmosphere.
It's a totally different ballgame.
Exactly. So if multi-billion-dollar European defense contractors are struggling to build the NAPT, how realistic is it that a cruise missile maker like Firepoint can reinvent air defense on a budget in 12 months? Like, is Zelensky's timeline just a political negotiation tactic to shame Western partners into sending more Patriots?
Well, you're touching on the fundamental friction here between political messaging and engineering reality. Because no single company is going to design, test, and mass produce a brand new kinetic interceptor in 365 days.
Right, it's just not physically possible.
But the one-year deadline serves a dual purpose. Yes, it's a blunt instrument for political leverage, signaling to Washington and Brussels that Ukraine is preparing to move on without them if necessary.
Okay.
But strategically, it forces a wartime industrial revolution. Firepoint doesn't necessarily need to invent the technology from scratch. They need to act as a high-speed integrator.
Oh, I see. So licensing European radar tech and combining it with domestic propulsion systems.
Exactly. This is about shifting from American dependency to European self-sufficiency, because American dependency has proven to be too volatile.
Yeah, shifting political winds in Washington, plus flare-ups in the Middle East, means the Patriot pipeline can dry up at any moment.
And they are attempting to force this industrial pivot because the alternative is literally watching their thermal energy grid get systematically dismantled before winter.
Wow. But here's the immediate problem for Kyiv, right? A European missile shield. Even if Firepoint pulls off some sort of integration miracle, it's still at least a year away.
Yes.
And the ballistic missiles and drones are hitting the power plants today.
Which forces a major tactical shift and brings us to the second layer of this security reality.
Right, because if you don't have the shield to catch the weapons in the sky, you are forced into a corner. You have to cross the border and destroy the weapons before they're launched.
Exactly. The delay in defensive capabilities necessitates a highly aggressive offensive posture. It's the brutal logic of attrition,
which we see manifested in these recent strikes deep inside Russian territory. Because, according to Anadolu Agency, Ukraine claims its forces carried out a coordinated overnight strike on the Atlanta Defense Industrial Complex.
Right, in the southwestern Russian city of Taganrog.
And the targets were very specific. They didn't just hit a random warehouse. They reportedly struck logistics depots and ammunition storage across occupied regions like Donetsk and Zaporizhia, alongside the factory in Taganrog.
Yeah, and Atlanta is a highly specialized node in Russia's military supply chain. That facility handles the design, production, and testing of Molniya-type strike and reconnaissance drones, as well as components for the Orion UAV.
Let's unpack the significance of those specific systems for a second. What makes the Orion and Molniya drones so critical to the Russian war effort?
Well, the Orion is a medium-altitude, long-endurance drone, a male UAV.
Okay.
It acts as the eyes for the Russian military, providing deep reconnaissance and target acquisition for those very ballistic missiles we were just discussing.
I see.
And the Molniya acts as a loitering munition, a strike drone capable of hitting infrastructure. So by targeting the Atlanta facility, Ukraine is attempting to blind the Russian missile operators and choke off the supply of strike drones at the source.
We do have to acknowledge the intense information war surrounding these strikes, though, because the official narratives are completely contradictory.
Always.
You have the Russian governor of the Rostov region, Yuri Slyusar, stating on Telegram that the strike merely hit commercial infrastructure, causing a warehouse fire and injuring 3 people. And at the same time, Russia's defense ministry claims their forces are successfully neutralizing Ukrainian energy and drone sites. We are constantly peering through the fog of war here. Independent verification of the actual damage at Atlant Arrow is basically impossible right now.
It is, but while those official statements trade conflicting accounts of warehouse fires, the human cost of these drone capabilities is undeniable.
Yeah, the sources detail a really grim reality in northern Ukraine. A Russian drone strike on the city of Cherniv recently killed a 16-year-old boy. Rescuers literally had to recover his body from the rubble.
It's awful.
4 other civilians were injured, and multiple residential houses were set on fire. It's this relentless daily reality that underscores exactly why Ukraine feels compelled to strike facilities like Atlant Arrow.
But it raises a really valid question about scale and impact, doesn't it?
If I look at the size of Russia's defense industrial base, I mean, it spans 11 time zones and involves hundreds of thousands of workers. So it feels a bit like a high-stakes game of whack-a-mole. Let's assume Ukraine's claims are completely accurate and they successfully cripple the Atlant Arrow facility. Does a localized strike actually dent a war machine of that magnitude?
Well, in isolation, no. A single factory going offline does not halt the Russian military. But the strategy here is less about a knockout blow and more like pulling a loose thread on a sweater.
Okay.
The goal is to force Russia into a defensive posture over its own interior.
Meaning, if factories in places like Taganrog are suddenly vulnerable, Moscow can't just leave them exposed.
Exactly. They have to respond. They are forced to pull anti-aircraft systems away from the front lines in Donetsk or Zaporizhia and redeploy them hundreds of miles inland.
Oh, to protect domestic infrastructure.
Right. They have to stretch their logistical supply lines thinner. It creates systemic friction. And for Ukraine, forcing that friction buys them the one resource they are critically short on.
Time.
Time to keep their energy grid functioning, and time to develop that European missile shield architecture we talked about.
Right. But this strategy of attrition, forcing friction, stretching supply lines, it has a massive hidden cost. It really does. We've been talking about the military and industrial framework of national security. But when you stretch a country's resources this thin for this long, the internal civic framework starts to buckle. Yes. And that brings us to the third layer of our deep dive today. While officials are out negotiating for continent-wide ballistic shields, there was a horrifying, localized breakdown of safety right in the heart of Ukraine's capital.
Which forces us to look at the toll of the war, beyond just the energy grid and the front lines. The actual human infrastructure that holds a society together is experiencing unprecedented strain.
Yeah, the details provided by The Independent regarding this incident in Kyiv are just devastating. Over the weekend, there was a deadly rampage in the Holosivsky district.
Right.
A 58-year-old Moscow-born gunman opened fire on civilians with an automatic rifle. He killed 6 people and injured 14 others.
And this is a mass shooting taking place in the middle of a capital city that is already navigating the constant baseline trauma of aerial bombardment.
Exactly. And the specifics highlight a terrifying level of chaos. After shooting civilians in the street, the gunman barricaded himself inside a local supermarket with hostages.
Yeah.
Law enforcement attempted to negotiate with him for 40 minutes without any success. Ultimately, special forces stormed the building and the gunman was shot dead. And Ukraine's security service is currently investigating the event as a terrorist act.
The casualty report from this is a stark reminder of the localized terror these events inflict.
It is. Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko confirmed that among the injured is a 12-year-old child whose parents were killed in the shooting. The child is currently in moderate condition in the hospital and is now orphaned.
It's just heartbreaking.
Furthermore, medical personnel had to treat an infant at the scene for carbon monoxide poisoning because the attacker actually set a nearby building on fire during the rampage. It's an absolute tragedy. But what elevates this from a localized crime to a matter of national security is the institutional shockwave it triggered within Ukraine's domestic security apparatus.
Because the handling of the incident revealed a catastrophic failure at the street level.
Right. The head of Ukraine's patrol police, Yevhen Zhukov, abruptly resigned on Sunday. And the catalyst for his resignation was a video that went viral on social media.
It was hard to watch.
The footage showed his own patrol officers literally running away when they heard the gunfire, leaving civilians entirely unprotected.
Yeah.
Zhukov, who is a combat veteran himself, publicly stated that the officers acted disgracefully, failing to assess the situation and abandoning civilians in danger. And Interior Minister Klimenko also intervened, calling their behavior a disgrace to the entire system.
To have the head of a national patrol police force resign during wartime because his officers fled from a single gunman, that points to a severe fracturing of the civil framework.
It feels like an incredible disconnect. I mean, it's agonizing irony. You have Ukrainian soldiers holding off one of the world's largest militaries in brutal trench warfare on the front line,
Right.
and defense contractors plotting out state-of-the-art ballistic missile shields. But right in the capital, the local beat cops ran away from a man with a rifle. It's like the country has impenetrable armor on the outside, but the internal framework is fracturing under the weight of exhaustion.
It's a really good way to put it.
So what does this total police failure actually reveal about the hidden, compounding toll of the war on civil society? Because it goes beyond simple cowardice, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. It reveals a phenomenon known as societal fatigue, and it is a critical vulnerability. We so often conceptualize national security purely through a military lens, the troops, the tanks, the kinetic kill vehicles. But a nation is fundamentally held together by its civil services. The police, the firefighters, the paramedics, the municipal workers. These are the people who make a city actually function day to day.
And those civil servants have been operating under a state of constant low-level terror for over 2 years.
Exactly. They are dealing with air raid sirens, rolling blackouts, and just the compounding grief of a wartime society.
Yeah.
The human nervous system is simply not designed to sustain that level of hypervigilance indefinitely. What we witnessed in that viral video of the police officers retreating, it wasn't just individual failure, it was a symptom of an entire system that is saturated with trauma.
Wow.
When the baseline level of stress in a society is sustained at that height for that long, the psychological resilience required to run toward gunfire, to just execute the standard operating procedures of a police officer, it can erode completely.
So this supermarket shooting and the institutional collapse surrounding it, it's a glaring warning sign that the civic foundation is just exhausted.
It really is.
So when you look at all these pieces together for our listeners, what picture emerges? Today, we've examined a nation fighting for its survival on 3 vastly different planes simultaneously.
Yep.
You have the high-level pursuit of a futuristic, independent European ballistic missile shield driven by a global shortage of Patriot systems.
Right, aiming for self-sufficiency.
Then you have the tactical necessity of launching surgical drone strikes deep into Russian territory, targeting facilities like Atlanta Aero to blind the incoming threats.
Playing offense because defense isn't ready.
Exactly. And at the exact same time, you have a domestic security apparatus struggling to maintain basic law and order on the streets of Kyiv, buckling under the weight of societal fatigue.
It illustrates that national security is a remarkably fragile and interconnected ecosystem. We focus so much on the hardware, the radar systems, the interceptors, the drone factories.
Yeah.
But the hardware fundamentally relies on human software. It requires the high-tech brilliance of engineers at a company like Firepoint to reverse engineer a missile shield, sure, but it equally relies on the psychological resilience of a local police officer on a random afternoon.
Because if one layer fails, the whole system shudders.
Exactly. If the civil foundation fails, the advanced military hardware loses its anchor. And the interconnectivity is brutal. The lack of a robust missile shield allows more strikes to penetrate the energy grid.
Which deepens the societal exhaustion and trauma.
Right. Which in turn leads to institutional failures, like police officers abandoning their posts during a crisis.
It's a vicious cycle. And this brings us to a really stark realization about how this conflict is being managed globally versus how it is being endured locally.
Yeah, there is a profound disconnect between the diplomatic sphere and the reality on the ground.
This is a really jarring juxtaposition that we pulled from the sources. Consider everything we just discussed. Ukraine is desperately trying to reinvent its defense industry to stop ballistic missiles. They're recovering victims from drone strikes in Chernihiv.
Right.
They were dealing with the fallout of a mass shooting and institutional failure in Kyiv supermarket. Yet, diplomatic life continues in an entirely different reality.
It really does, because according to the dispatches, while all of that chaos unfolds, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is currently attending an event in Turkey.
Yeah. And his focus is entirely removed from the physical realities of the war. He is actively pitching the idea of renewed economic cooperation to the incoming U.S. Trump administration.
Right.
He's discussing how Washington and Moscow might view future economic ties, positioning this dialogue as a potential path to a diplomatic detente.
It is the ultimate split-screen reality. On one side of the screen, you have the visceral reality of a 12-year-old child orphaned in a supermarket shooting and cities plunging into darkness.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you have the sanitized, calculated rhetoric of high-level diplomacy calmly discussing the prospects of future economic cooperation.
It is an impossible reality to bridge. And that's the provocative thought we want to leave you with today. How do we reconcile those two worlds?
It's a tough question.
It is. How can the sterile diplomatic language of economic ties and detenting possibly account for the bloody, chaotic reality of a 16-year-old pulled from the rubble, or a civil police force fracturing under the weight of an unending war?
When the fundamental fabric of a society is being tested this severely, what does a diplomatic resolution actually look like to the people living through it?
Exactly. We want to thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive today. Keep questioning the narratives you hear, look closely at the different layers of these complex issues, and stay insanely curious. We'll catch you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.